Keto diet and adrenal fatigue. A lot of people are interested in these two topics, but they have some concerns that it may not be a good idea to combine the two. So we're going to explore those topics coming right up. So can you do the keto diet if you think that you have adrenal fatigue? So let's talk about the adrenal glands first. What do they do? What's their purpose, etc. Whenever we have stress, whenever your nervous system perceives stress, then it's the adrenal glands that sit on top of the kidney. They're actually an extension of the brain. The adrenal glands, even though they're so far out into the body, they are an extension of nervous tissue because the nervous system doesn't have time to relay the information. It wants to drop the info right away. So there are no synapses between the brain and the adrenal glands. So adrenal glands are super important and they need to respond quickly. That's their purpose. So they carry out the hormonal instructions whenever the brain responds to stress. What is stress? Well, stress is an increased need. Whether we have an emotional stress that you're sitting in your car on the freeway and somebody cuts you off or does something rude and your knuckles go white. Now you just had a stress response because your body is anticipating a fight. It thinks that there's going to be something in the near future that requires increased energy resources. So it wants to mobilize more resources so that you're prepared for that fight. Physical stress, that's if you exercise, for example, then you have an increased demand and your body makes available those resources. Or if you're fasting, so if you're not eating for a while, then your blood sugar starts to go down and you need to have a system of mobilizing energy from the stores. You need to get the resources available. So whether it's emotional, physical, or fasting, that's still a stress that results in the perception of an increased need. So now what the body does is it responds, the adrenals respond by making cortisol. And cortisol, the purpose of cortisol is to raise blood sugar. Because blood sugar is the fastest fuel in an emergency. So when we have stress, the body wants more blood sugar. And the cortisol mobilizes the blood sugar from glycogen stores. So the way the body can store glucose is in the form of glycogen. Then we have a limited amount of stores, and whenever we have stress, cortisol tells the body to start retrieving fuel from those stores. And then when the blood sugar goes up, we also have an insulin response because the insulin is necessary to deliver that glucose to the cells that need it for fuel. Another function of cortisol is to regulate your sleep rhythms, your circadian rhythms. So when you go to bed, your blood sugar is high because you're normally in a well-fed state, but then you don't eat during the night. So cortisol is the lowest when you go to bed, but then because you don't eat, because you're fasting while you're sleeping, the cortisol rises gradually and it hits a peak right around the time when you wake up. And that's because cortisol is also involved in waking you up. Cortisol is directly opposed to melatonin, which is your sleep hormone. So that's why it's part of your sleep cycle. So it's the highest when you wake up and your body anticipates food, and once you're awake, the cortisol starts dropping off again. So far it seems like everything I've said indicates that keto and fasting would be a bad idea because it would increase the demand on the adrenal gland. And that is true, but we need to really explore this next part to understand the bigger picture of this, that even though fasting and keto can be a little stressful in the short term, it is the best solution in the long term. And to eat more carbs and frequent meals is the very thing that perpetuates the problem. So what happens when we go keto? When we cut our carbs way, way, way down, then the body has to start looking for an alternative source of fuel. So it looks for fat. Fat is plentiful. It's a great fuel. And it learns to burn the fat. And now the glycogen stores go down because we're not eating so much carbohydrate, so much glucose that the body can turn into glycogen. So the glycogen stores go down. So again, that might look like a bad thing because we want that glycogen for blood sugar, and if we don't have it, then the body might have to work extra hard to make cortisol. But again, it works the other way around because, and here's the key, when we go into ketosis, we teach the body to use another fuel. So now we learn to burn fat for the most part and ketones for the brain. So the body can learn to run on 90% fat, and the brain can run about 75% or so on ketones and 25% on glucose. But that's a very, very small amount of glucose needed. So when we go into keto, when we become keto adapted, fat adapted, we reduce our reliance on cortisol. We reduce our reliance on glucose for fuel. So the need for cortisol is much, much less, and now the adrenals get to rest. One further advantage, of course, is that if we don't need to make so much cortisol and we don't eat so many carbs, then our insulin is also going to go down. Cortisol drives insulin, so with less carbs, less cortisol, now we have two ways of reducing that insulin. So the key to understand is that, yes, cortisol does work like this, but we're more dependent on cortisol if we are adapted to a carbohydrate metabolism. Once we become adapted to a fat metabolism, we don't need so much glycogen. We're not as reliant on glucose, and then the need for cortisol drops dramatically. When we develop a stable blood sugar through fat adaptation, now most of these problems go away, the adrenals get to rest up, and everything starts balancing itself much, much better. The other thing that I want to mention though is there's the caution here. And for people who also want to combine the keto diet with intermittent fasting, because there's a transition period here. When you're going from a carb dependency into a fat adaptation and intermittent fasting, that is a stress on the body because during this transition, your body isn't really good yet at getting the fuel from the fat. It still wants that carbohydrate. So now it's going to go crazy on the cortisol because it's trying to retrieve it. So what you want to do then is you want to go really, really slow. You start off with lowering your carbs somewhat. You cut out all of the processed foods and the sugary foods, and then you start reducing the number of meals. You start cutting out the snacks, you get down to 3 meals, and then you start gradually maybe pushing the breakfast a little bit until you can get down to 2 meals. So do all this very, very slowly so that your body can get adapted, so your body can slowly get adapted to the fat adaptation. Because if you are carb dependent and you go straight into intermittent fasting and keto, then there's going to be a few weeks where your adrenals are going to be overworked, and that may not be a good idea. It probably won't be a good idea because you won't feel so good in the process. But the keto and the intermittent fasting is the long-term solution. So just learn how to do it and do it gradually. So if you enjoyed these kinds of explanations and you found some value in this, please make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification bell. And it's very easy to share these videos. We really appreciate when you help us help others by sharing. So you can click the share and then it takes you to, you can single click and share it on Facebook, Twitter, etc. Thanks for watching.